Well, good morning. I think we have an exciting talk scheduled for this morning. It's my pleasure to introduce Steve Esser. He's a research staff member at IBM Research, where he's working on the development of brain-inspired algorithms and applications to run on the Truenorth cognitive computing system. He completed graduate work in neuroscience at the University of Wisconsin, focusing on computational models of the brain during sleep and while being awake. His research interests include computational neuroscience, machine learning, and neural networks. Please welcome Steve.
All right, thank you and good morning to everybody. So I think we're all very aware in this room how much our brains can do, right? They can take in complex, real-time, noisy, sensory data. They can make plans based on that data. They can perceive patterns in that data. And they can create complex motor actions from that data. They can do this all in real time with low response latency and all fueled by a budget of a few thousand calories a day. Now, for decades, computer scientists have been struggling to reproduce this behavior in artificial systems and brain-inspired computing. And despite a tremendous amount of effort that's gone into this, we've struggled to actually reproduce these types of behaviors, even at a small scale, and especially to do so for the same power budget our own brain operates on. And so that's the dream that we have in the IBM SyNAPSE team, is to actually make this a possibility, make it possible to do brain-inspired computing for a budget approximating what our own brains can do. Our aspiration is to build a system with 10 billion neurons that fits in a 2-liter box that uses less than 10 kilowatts of power. We think this is really just critical to being able to advance the field of brain-inspired computing and to see this dream come to life of having computers that can do some of the functions that our brains are capable of doing. And what I'd like to do today is walk you through what we've done so far towards this goal and kind of share with you some of the motivating factors that we had as we went through our work that kind of inspired the direction that we went in. So we began the endeavor by looking at neuroscience. So what you can see here is the largest graph currently in existence of the monkey brain. In this graph, along the outer circumference, you can see a number of different areas in the cortex and subcortex that subserve functions of vision, perception, action, and cognition. And we created this graph by looking at the COCOMAC database. So in this database, there's over 6 decades of anatomical studies looking at the macaque monkey. What we did is we took this information, digested it, compiled it, integrated it to create this graph structure you see here with over 383 different areas, 6,600 connections. And our goal was to essentially mathematize the brain, separate it out from the biological wetware so we can begin to understand the interesting structures that we see within the brain. Once we did that, what we could begin to do is, first of all, take a high-level view of the brain. So what you can see here is some visualization work done by a former teammate of ours, Emmett McQuinn. And he essentially took this information and placed it in a easy to digest and intuit format where brain areas are color-coded by function, so vision's one color, action's another color, and so on along the outside of the brain, outside of the graph. And then the wires between these areas are coded by thickness. So thicker wires mean more connections. And what you can see from this, and especially if you begin to analyze this in more detail, is that the structure of the brain, it's not random connections, it's not purely long-range connections, it's not purely short-range connections. Instead, it's a mix of what's called small world connectivity, where you have lots of locally connected neighborhoods that are in turn connected to one another through a mix of longer-range connections. We can also begin to look at specific connections between functional regions. Here you can see 3 of the areas involved in the lower visual processing in our brain. And we can go beyond these types of figures to actually look at the brain in a more mathematical context. So what we did here is we looked at the number of connections between each brain area. So some brain areas might connect to one other area, some might connect to dozens of other areas. And what we wanted to do is look at the distribution of these different connections. It was an open question going into this, what degree distribution does the brain follow? One possibility is what's called a scale-free distribution. A critical feature of this type of distribution is that the most important nodes in the network are able to connect to many other different types of nodes in the graph. This is a degree distribution followed by social networks and several other graphs, the World Wide Web. And it's interesting because it sort of posits that the most important nodes should have access, unlimited access essentially, to other nodes in the graph. Now, the other candidate that we considered was an exponential distribution. This is the type of distribution followed by air traffic networks, power grids, collaboration networks, and company boards of directors. And the important feature of this type of distribution for us is that even the most important nodes in the graph only make a limited number of connections to other nodes elsewhere in the graph structure. And that's the case whenever there's strong physical limitations on the connectivity of your graph structure. And we found that this exponential distribution is what we found in the brain. And that was really nice because it fits well with other research suggesting that physical limitations do play an important factor in determining the structure of our brain. It was also very important when we began to think about designing hardware because it tells us a lot about the types of connectivity we'll need to support within the structures that we want to be able to build. We also looked beyond just connectivity in the brain to look a little bit more at the important anatomical structures in the brain. We asked the question, what are the most central structures in this brain structure that we have? And there's a number of different ways to look at this idea of centrality. You might say brain areas that make the most connections are most central to the brain structure. But you can run into problems with views like that because those brain areas might connect to many areas, but those areas in turn may only make one other connection or even just connect back to the source area. So a more compelling way to go about this is to begin to actually peel the graph back to find what is the most central structures. So the approach we took was to start with brain areas that connect to only one other area, remove them from the graph completely. Of what we have left, we could then, we'd have new areas that now only connect to one other area since we previously removed some. So we can iteratively begin to remove more and more areas, just kind of going deeper and deeper. Eventually we remove areas that connect to two other brain areas, and so on. Most graphs that you look at, you can peel away very quickly, just a small number of iterations until you get to the central core. With this brain-like structure, we found that the connectivity is so rich, it took us many different iterations to finally get back to a core set of central structures. And the structures that we found, they're located primarily in the prefrontal cortex of our brain. And once we kind of had that in mind, the obvious question to ask is, well, what do those brain areas do? We know they're central in terms of connectivity. But what if we were to look anatomically, or functionally, sorry, at what these areas do? So for that, we turned to functional neuroscience techniques like fMRI and EEG. And while we didn't do any of this work ourselves, there's a huge body of work out there that we could turn to. And it turns out that the anatomical areas that we'd identified are part of what's called a task-positive, task-negative set of brain regions. And these brain regions, they're found to light up not during any particular task, not during speech, not during vision, not during any specific thing. Rather, they're active across a huge range of different tasks, and they're believed to be critical to integrating the activity of many further specialized brain regions, and thus are central to both cognition and consciousness. So this, while it didn't directly influence the types of hardware that we later wanted to build, was very nice as sort of a spin-off neuroscience observation, in that it let us link essentially decades of anatomical neuroscience with decades of functional neuroscience to show that they really are working towards the same problem. So with that little bit of neuroscience in hand, we began to go deeper, looking further at more and more connectivity studies done by other neuroscientists, and began to formulate essentially a vision statement of what we wanted to do, what approaches we wanted to look at to actually build this hardware that we're interested in. So about 4 or 5 years ago, we released this vision statement in Communications of the ACM, and we really put forward 2 major tenets that we wanted to kind of go after in our designs. The first was, of course, we wanted to achieve brain-like function, but the second was we wanted to do this using as little power as possible. And we wanted to go about this by using the brain as a template for our designs, but to always put forward brain-like function as being more important than brain-like form. So we like the analogy of flight as we went about designing our hardware, where if you want to design an airplane, it may be useful to look at birds to learn basic aerodynamic principles, so lift and drag and so on. But you don't want to get hung up on the flapping motion of the bird's wings as you design your plane, because it's really not critical to the actual process of flight itself. And so we thought the same thing. Let's not get hung up on things that are just purely biological. Let's really get to the essence of what the brain's trying to do when we did our designs. So as I mentioned, we looked a lot at brain-like connectivity. We also looked at the major computational elements in our brains, the neurons. And again, we didn't do any of our own physiology work, but we did look at a huge body of existing research in this area. Just to give you a quick walkthrough of how a neuron works. So neurons are just cells, just like many of the other cells in our bodies, except that they're specialized for computation and communication. Neurons receive inputs over bodies called the dendrites from other neurons. They take in this input and they integrate the input by producing changes in the voltage difference across their cell membrane. As they get more and more input, that voltage difference will change. And if it reaches a certain threshold, the neuron will emit an action potential or a spike. This is a signal that travels out along axons to other neurons in our body. They can be millimeters, centimeters, or even meters away in some cases. And the interesting thing about these action potentials or spikes is that they're essentially binary. They're electrical pulses. They have about the same size or shape each time they get emitted. And it's an all or none response. That's what this analogy up here was trying to show you, is it builds up and then it fires. And the really nice thing about neuron behavior is that computational neuroscientists have come up with some very elegant, simple, yet powerful equations to describe their behavior. And these are equations that are very suitable for efficiently implementing in hardware. So we sort of sorted through it, found out the key simple types of equations we wanted to implement, and brought that in as we began to think more and more about the hardware we wanted to build. Okay, so before we get to the hardware, we of course needed to make sure our ideas would work, make sure they were sensible, make sure they could scale, and make sure they could achieve the functions we wanted. So we started out by looking at simulations of the designs we wanted to build. And we wanted to use those simulations, like I said, to test out the function, but also to make sure we could go up to these scales that we were interested in. And so as we designed our simulator, we did a number of scaling studies on the simulator itself to make sure it could tackle the types of scales we eventually wanted to go to in hardware. So we began with mouse cortex scale simulations in 2007. And over the course of 5 years, we gradually scaled these up from Blue Gene L through Blue Gene P to Blue Gene Q machines, while the simulations themselves went up from mouse scale to rat scale, and eventually up to human scale simulations. And again, to stress, this is just human scale, not human function. That's a very different question, obviously. But what we found is that as we scaled up, we, of course, threw more resources at the problem, 24 times more racks of machines, 200 times more CPUs, 800 times more memory, 1,000-fold, and by doing this, we achieved a 1,000-fold increase in the number of synapses in our network, so essentially the size of the network. And it also underwent a 300-fold slowdown in terms of the speed at which we could run it. Eventually, though, as I mentioned, we did hit our goal of human scale simulation. In the end, this required what you see here, which is 96 racks of the Blue Gene Q Sequoia machine. So that's a room full of these racks. 1.5 million processors, 1.5 petabytes of main memory. And like I said, despite all of this, we still were running slower than real time, about 1,500 times slower than real time. Now, we could hypothetically imagine a computer that could run this human scale simulation in real time. We could just do some simple scaling studies to figure out about how much power it would take. And it turns out such a machine would take 12 gigawatts of electricity to power it. Now, meanwhile, the human brain takes about 12 watts of power to run. So we're talking a billion-fold disparity in the amount of power between our brain and these simulations that we ran. Also, obviously, our brain fits in about 2 liters of volume. I just showed you an entire room full of servers needed to run that human scale simulation. So what does this mean? Well, we're very sure this doesn't mean that today's computers are a bad architecture. They're obviously capable of many, many, many useful things. What we instead believe is that simply our brains have a very, very different architecture from modern-day computers. And that's where we think we can come in and do something useful. By designing a new architecture that's much closer to the way our brain is structured, we think we can be much more efficient. So what might that architecture look like? Well, we started going deeper into this by initially just looking at what are today's existing architectures. You could imagine sort of an imaginary plot of all of today's architectures, everything possible in CMOS, plotted on sort of a 2D plane, so FPGAs, CPUs, GPUs. Now obviously the brain, it's not in CMOS, it has its own biological wetware. It's not going to be on this plane. But we wanted to envision what would be the architecture that's the most brain-like, that's closest to this particular plane, and that's what we wanted to go after. And we made this very concrete by saying, not only do we want to achieve that brain-like architecture, we also want it to maximize the number of neurons, maximize the number of synapses, minimize energy, minimize area, maximize speed, maximize flexibility, and maximize scalability. And as we sort of look deeper and deeper, we made a number of other useful observations. One of them is this. If you actually look at today's architectures in terms of clock frequency and power density, clock frequency has gone up by about 3 orders of magnitude in the last 4 decades. Power density has gone up by about 2 orders of magnitude. So we can see the steady march in the northeast direction of this graph. So okay, that's interesting. Where now does the brain fall on this particular graph? Well, if we extrapolate out the other direction, we see the brain actually operates at about 1 to 10 hertz. So if you look at spike rates in the brain, they're actually very, very slow compared to today's modern clocks on today's modern computers. Power density is also considerably less than modern computers. That's why we only need to eat, a limited amount of food per day. So we kept this in mind as we looked to design our circuits and thought, can we actually reduce our power by going with a lower clock speed like this, yet still achieve brain-like function? And then the other big difference between the brain and modern computers is the fundamental architecture itself. So this is the von Neumann architecture at its essence. We have computation on the left, memory on the right, separated by a bus. And it's that bus that presents both a bottleneck and a huge, huge power draw. Because every time we want to do a computation, we move data from memory to CPU and then move it back over, burning a ton of power going back and forth. Now, meanwhile, the brain looks a little more like this. We have computation and memory co-located together. Synapses provide our memory. They're located right there with the neurons. And because of that, we don't need to move data back and forth when we do, or at least move it out of memory whenever we do computations in our own brains. So we followed this model to design our own architecture. So the architecture we came up with, we call Truenorth. It's based on a number of cores. You can see one core circled here, where each core encapsulates a block of neurons, a block of the memory for those neurons, and then a communication circuit. And by co-locating the neurons in memory, we reduce dramatically the amount of power we have to burn in the same way that the brain does. We also end up with a very parallel distributed architecture, just like you see here. This architecture is very fault tolerant, just like our brain is. If one of our cores dies, we can simply turn it off and route around it. And because we built so many cores, that's a very, very small loss to us. And it's also very modular. So here you can see just 9 of our cores arrayed in a grid. We can scale this up dramatically in the 2 dimensions, this way and this way, as we need to, as we want to go to bigger and bigger circuits. Finally, in terms of computation, I mentioned neuron behavior a little while ago. We took in some of these computational neuroscience equations to build our own neuron model, and we ended up with a neuron that's very simple, very elegant, takes very few parameters, requires very little memory, very little computation, yet at the same time, it's capable of reproducing a number of features, a number of behaviors observed in neuroscience. And it's also capable of producing a number of fundamental computational behaviors. So we can do things like addition and subtraction, exponentials, sigmoids, all using a very small number of these neurons, and from there then build up to more and more complicated functions. So that gave us the architecture. In 2011, we began to actually bend metal and create a chip. And our first chip was simply a proof of concept. We built 2 cores, each with 256 neurons, so it's about the scale of the worm brain. And with those cores in hand, we then set to create some demonstrations of their capability. It turns out that worm-like things aren't that exciting to make demos of. So instead, we looked to more human-like tasks. So we had the chips configured to do digit recognition, and we also set them up to play the game of Pong. The computer, or the Truenorth chip, actually beat our DARPA program director at the time at a game of Pong, which may or may not have been useful in getting us further funding. But it was a it was a nice demonstration of its utility. So that was nice. That gave it, in about 1 year, we created the chips, we demonstrated them, and we thought we had something useful because we could actually do useful functions. So the next task then, of course, is to scale it up, try to go for these real-world scale applications. So we did this just by essentially creating a sea of these cores. We can just tile up north, south, east, west. And what's nice about the architecture is that you can see here these cores. Even though they span huge distances, they're not limited to communicating only with neighboring cores. The communication network supports any core talking to any other core in this network. So we're really not limited by size. We then took this architecture, this design, and put this into a chip a couple years ago. And the chip we created had, 5.4 billion transistors. It was created in Samsung's 28 nanometer low power process. The chip had 4,096 cores total. I believe you can see them, or the memory over here. That's a 64 by 64 array, and each of those cores in turn had 256 neurons. So that gave us 1 million neurons in a package that could fit in the palm of your hand, using less than 100 milliwatts of power to be able to achieve real-world applications in real time. And I'll get to those applications in a few slides. But first, before we could start to do things with it, we had to test it. So we did have a brief moment of trepidation when we first got the chip back from the fab. So this is a completely new architecture in a process that was new to IBM. It's one of the largest chips ever made in terms of transistor count. Would this thing actually work for us out of the box, or would we have to do a respin, burn a lot of time and effort? So what we did is we created a custom fabricated test board, which you can see here. And we use this to be able to test every single connection, every single computation element of the chip. So we completely put it through its motions. And to our delight, we found that it worked exactly as we hoped. So we had something out of the box that we could start to play with. And what was really cool is someone brought in a thermal camera that they had to actually take a photograph of this thing to show off its low power capabilities. So you can see the thermal plot here. This here is Truenorth, this nice, cool blue guy. On the far right here, this is the FPGA that's used to load the parameters and do the testing of the chip itself. So you can really see the low power, low heat capabilities of this chip really nicely in that plot. Okay, so, and just as a little point of reference, there's about a 5,000-fold difference in terms of the power density between this chip and an FPGA or any other type of processor that we could run today. Okay, so with this chip in hand, we began to kind of put it out to the press, start to make applications for it. One nice thing that happened for us is that we were honored to be named as runner-up of the year for Science's Breakthrough of the Year, or sorry, runner-up for Science's Breakthrough of the Year. We unfortunately lost out to the Rosetta spacecraft, which you may remember put a lander on a comet, which is pretty impressive, although they did have a couple $100 more million than we did. And as we continue to scale this thing up, our next step, which we just very recently completed, was to create a board where now we're not just tiling the cores, we're actually tiling these chips. So each of these chips you see here contains 4,096 of our cores. This is a 4x4 array, obviously. So with this board, we can now run 16 million of these neurons, 4 billion synapses in one nice package. So this same system you see here, it's about so big, one board, would take 4 racks of servers to duplicate using a von Neumann machine to duplicate the behavior of. And those 4 racks still couldn't run in real time, whereas this thing is a real-time machine. Okay, so that gives us the hardware side of things. Throughout the development process, we're of course interested in what can we actually do with this thing. We want to go beyond Pong. We want to go beyond digit recognition. And as we've gone forward, we've been very careful to keep one eye on the hardware development and one eye on software development to avoid situations like you see here. We really want these two groups to work closely together. And so from the very beginning, we put forward a couple ground rules. The first was that any simulations that we run on that simulator I showed you earlier, especially before we had the hardware, we were very careful to say that simulator has to be exactly one-to-one functionally equivalent with what the hardware can do, and any network we design has to run on that simulator. So that guarantees we don't have someone who comes up with an amazing algorithm that solves all the world's problems, but we can't actually implement it on our hardware. Everything we do is hardware compatible. Now second, within our group, we also made a big point to say, if you're going to report results on a cool network you came up with, that's great, but we want to know both the accuracy of the system, so task performance, so digit recognition, for example, but we also want to know how many cores does it take, how many spikes does it produce, because those are both very close approximators for how much power that network will use, and it just tells us if we're going to build a chip with 4,096 cores, could that chip actually run your network? And by doing this, we found our first few passes at creating networks were actually very inefficient. They got really good accuracy because we very directly mapped some existing algorithms to them. But we found if we just put a couple more cycles into it, we could literally reduce the number of cores they took by 1 or even 2 orders of magnitude. So it really forced us to think natively in terms of the architecture we built. And by doing so, we came up with a lot of very interesting and useful networks. And to that point, this is really a fundamental thing we found, especially when new people come to the group. The natural thing is we'll bring in someone who knows about computer vision, for example, and they'll try to take an existing von Neumann or even a neural network algorithm that works really well on a CPU or a GPU and just kind of naively map it into the Truenorth space. And what we found is this really is sort of a square peg round hole problem where it's not really the right design for Truenorth. Von Neumann naturally lends itself to sequential, deep types of algorithms, whereas Truenorth, it's naturally a neural network. It's very parallel, extremely parallel, very good for distributed, but yet somewhat shallow types of computations. And so we've kind of put together a mentality where we want to take a training algorithm, for example, that's from the neural network community, and we want to constrain it first. Put in all the constraints of the Truenorth architecture, its connectivity, its computational capabilities, the precision on the synapses, and then train our networks instead of trying to come up with some network, train it, and then map it in some sort of weird way back to Truenorth. And again, by doing that, we get really, really efficient things compared to the more naive approach. As we go deeper and deeper and deeper into the existing field of deep learning, which is essentially just a set of tools for training neural networks and algorithms and various structures, what we're sort of seeing is that we have the chance to bring together two different complementary revolutions. One is the field of deep learning, which is a progressively, almost exponentially growing field today of ways to train neural networks, where capabilities really is taking off. And we think that can be used as a method for training architectures like our architecture in neuromorphic computing, where the Truenorth, for example, could be a low-power delivery platform for what deep learning can give us. So as we begin to think more and more about how to do deep learning for Truenorth, like I said, we're really trying to think natively in terms of our architecture. And one of the first things that we have to confront, just to give you a little sample of this, is how to think in terms of spikes. So most neural networks, and many neural networks today, they deliver continuous value, floating point data from neuron to neuron. Truenorth, just like our brain, uses these binary pulses. So just to show you a simple way how it's still a very powerful system, it's not really limiting in any way. You could imagine we want to encode this image of a tiger here. One way we might do that is what's called a stochastic rate code. It's very simple. We just say the intensity of a particular pixel gets mapped to the number of spikes delivered in a given time window. We also might do some simple pre-processing, like extract the edges first. And what you can see is that when we do this sort of a stochastic rate code, any given instant in time is relatively noisy. But if we just start to integrate over a slightly larger time window, we can see we have all the information that we want to extract from this thing right here in these spikes. We can do more elaborate pre-processing than just edge extraction. So here you can see some images from the NeoVision dataset. This is a DARPA dataset. This is from a helicopter flying over Los Angeles. So here we're not only extracting edges, we're also doing it at multiple different scales. And this can be useful when you expect to see, as you saw in the last one, fairly large planes in some cases, but the camera might move further away in other frames, and then things obviously look a lot smaller. We can also do color, not just black and white. Here you can see color opponent edges, green, blue, and green, purple, and red, blue. So all these pre-processing methods, these edge extractors, and the spike creation, it's actually inspired by our own retina. The nice thing is that not only is it inspired by our retina, there's also good information theoretic reasons to do this, namely that you're removing a lot of redundant correlated information from the images before you send them to the brain or to the chip. And that's very useful because it means, A, it just simplifies the processing, but more importantly, it reduces the number of spikes that we have to send from our sensor to the chip, and that in turn just helps us save more power. We're all about efficiency in the end. This is just one more way to do that. Now, that was a vision example. You can obviously imagine we could do this for audio. Our own brain does that, for scent, for touch, for taste. But we can move beyond the biological senses as well. There's no reason you can't do these types of techniques, these spike conversions, for radar, sonar, LiDAR, or any other type of sensory data that you might have. Okay, so once we have the data in spikes, what can we actually do with it? Here, this is another set of images or a movie from the NeoVision data set. This is from the Stanford Hoover Tower. The task here is to locate and classify cars, buses, trucks, cyclists, and people. And this system that you see here, we were able to actually run this on our hardware. I unfortunately wasn't able to bring the hardware. The guys back home are using it for other purposes right now, but this was recorded from a demo actually running on the hardware. The system you're seeing here, it achieves task performance, so basically accuracy, on par with state-of-the-art techniques that use traditional von Neumann machines, so CPUs, GPUs, and FPGAs. Yet, it's able to do this using about 2 orders of magnitude, or actually 2 to 3 orders of magnitude less power than these existing approaches. So for us, that was a really nice validation of our hardware, that we are able to get these really nice power improvements over everybody else. So we can also do this from a moving platform. Here you can see it from the same helicopter flying over Los Angeles. And once we see things like this, we can start to envision what kinds of applications we might build with this. So one thing we see that could be useful is you can begin to move your computation to the edge. In other words, you could put your Truenorth low-power sensor right on, say, a traffic camera. And that means instead of having to send a fire hose of data back to some server farm somewhere from your cameras all over the city, you can just do some processing right there on the camera. You can imagine some very simple sorts of features you might want to look for. For example, you could have the camera send back, everything here is okay, or an accident's happened, we need immediate attention here, and then bring in extra help. To deliver these types of this hardware and our training methods to the general public, that's obviously a big concern for us. We do use a lot of the same techniques from the neural network community, but we've modified them to make them a lot more efficient and natural to work on Truenorth. So what we're doing now is we're working with Café, which is essentially it's a toolkit and a code base that lets you deploy neural network algorithms. And it's very modular, which is nice because we can then come in and create our own modules that are Truenorth specific and then release these to the community, which knows how to use these tools and knows how to use them to build useful functions. Along with Café, we're creating an entire tool flow, a toolkit of tools that will essentially let us go from data in, spike creation, all the way to spikes out, and results of whatever your system should be doing. And as we look to future applications beyond that NeoVision classifier I showed you, we sort of see 4 different application spaces. One is mobile, so our phones now have many, many sensors on them. Obviously, power is a big concern on your mobile device. We see a use in embedded systems, for example, automobile safety, where real time is a really important criteria. We see a role in data centers, where low power means low cost. And we see a role in synaptic supercomputers, where, as I showed you earlier, to actually run a human scale simulation takes just tremendous amounts of power. And that might be possible on a one-off type of scenario. But if you want to do that on a regular basis, you really need some sort of low-power hardware that'll let you reliably do those types of runs and scale them out and do more than one of them. Okay. here you can see some concept demos we created of what we think might be possible. None of these actually exist yet, but we can imagine some useful devices, for example, like a medical device that goes well beyond what a thermometer can do in terms of giving you feedback about your health, but still in a nice portable package. We could imagine a simple drone with many sensors and actuators built in that could be, for example, rolled into a disaster scenario before first responders go in, just so they can kind of see what's there. We could imagine platforms of floating sensors in the ocean to monitor things like weather, ocean health, or sea lanes. We could imagine glasses that could help the blind understand their environment by giving audio cues based on what the glasses themselves see. And we could imagine small networks of sensors that could be distributed. Again, this is another disaster scenario around a wildfire, for example, and again, give firefighters or other first responders information about what's actually happening with that fire. And as we think more and more about these applications, I think one thing we're really very clearly realizing is that SyNAPSE and traditional computers, SyNAPSE is another name for Truenorth, they're very different architectures and they have very different uses and they're very complementary. So von Neumann machines, they're measured in floating point operations, and again, these are useful for high precision, sequential types of operations, whereas in Truenorth, we measure in terms of synaptic operations per second. And those are useful for these types of parallel, fault-tolerant, short types of processing. And so we sort of envision also eventually going to a space of hybrid computing where you could have both a traditional computer and a Truenorth computer working together to achieve a more useful function. And again, it's another concept model. As we begin to scale up both the applications, the hardware itself is also going to have to scale up. One nice thing we can do is because the chip itself uses so little power, we can stack them very closely together. So here you can see, I think this is eight different boards stacked together, essentially just one on top of another to give us a very nice, very dense package that we could put into a rack somewhere. Eventually, we're going to take this concept and in the near term, or nearish term, go all the way up to 1% of the human cortex with a 4096 chip machine. And we're also interested in going the other direction as well, going small. So this is a simple board about so big. It has one chip on it, and we're interested in distributing this out to interested parties in government, in universities, and in industry to kind of essentially play with our architecture, see what they can do with it, see if it's useful for them. And so actually starting next week, we're planning to give out a number of those boards to many individuals and teach them how to use it over a 3-week SyNAPSE University course. We're bringing in people, like I said, from all over industry and academia, and I think even a couple government labs as well to look at this. Okay, so as I wind things down here, I want to kind of, one of the last few things I want to show you is essentially a timeline of the project, just to give you an overview of where everything that I just talked about happened in time. So we started in 2004. It was the first time we began to think about this. And 2006 was the Almaden Grand Challenge. That was really when we first, in Almaden Institute, those were events IBM hosted where we really began to put rubber to the road and really began to kind of push things forward. Our first simulations happened in 2007. And in 2008, we got a DARPA grant, and that let us begin to really start scaling up the project. 2009, 2010, we continued to scale up our simulations. We did that wiring diagram work I mentioned. 2011, we went to we had the worm scale chips, our very first chips built and tested. 2012, we finally had our human scale simulations up and running. 2013, we did our first public outreach essentially with the chip where we hosted our first SyNAPSE University to teach other people to begin to use it. That was, I think, a 3-day session, and we realized there just wasn't enough time to learn all the tools and tricks and techniques we've put together. So we've since then scaled that to a 3-week program. Finally, 2014, we had the 16-chip board, and 2015, our latest accomplishment was the single chip board I showed you, our Raspberry Pi version of this particular architecture. So far, we've seen from the press a lot of mostly positive feedback. We've been excited that the promises we made early on didn't turn into vaporware, because I think that would have been very disappointing if we got all the press and then didn't have something that worked. So in the end, we've been very, very happy about that. Finally, I just want to close this out now, I guess, by thanking a number of people who made this project possible. It's been a huge project. I think over 200 people have contributed to this in some really, really hefty ways. This wouldn't have been possible without, certainly without DARPA. They provided a large amount of our funding, and in particular, two of their program managers who helped to guide our project, Todd Hilton and Gilt Pratt, really kind of kept us focused on our goals and on our targets. We had collaboration with a number of government institutions, with universities across the globe, and with IBM research labs across the globe as well. We had a lot of help from Lawrence Livermore National Lab, who provided us support and access to their Blue Gene L, P, and Q supercomputers. And finally, as I mentioned, literally over 200 people touched this project in some way to help make this all possible. And here you can just see a small number of us we managed to corral for our group photo at our last get-together. So right now, these guys are all back home, continuing to do amazing research and engineering, and we're very excited about what we can bring you guys next. So that brings me to the end of my talk, and I'd be happy to take a few questions if anyone has any.